Yeah, my country, Singapore. After we gained independence from the British, we were a struggling little nation. In order to survive, we formed a union with a larger, more powerful country, Malaysia. That's not the funny part. But then Malaysia broke up with us, just kicked us out of the union. And my prime minister went on TV to announce that Malaysia had dumped us. He cried because he thought we're not going to survive without Malaysia. But then, 40 years later, Singapore became a first world country. Crazy rich Asians? Yeah, that's us. And Malaysia, still a developing country. Oh, Malaysia. That's the best breakup revenge, man. Now Malaysia's trying to come around like, hey, Singapore, you're looking good lah. We're like, I know, but why haven't you visited me in 40 years? I tried, but you know, my airplanes cannot fly. Oh, what? Malaysian Airlines going missing? Not funny, huh? Forget it. Some jokes don't land. That goes from Singapore.
Oh, I literally just saw a Malay guy at Jurong MRT wearing a Free Palestine, Free Gaza shirt, so I'm not sure how many people of a certain religion feel about this. You can also check Insta stories. Hey, some people are actually putting personal and religious loyalties above that of the state right now. Israel has been one of Singapore's oldest allies, and the military relationship between us is literally closer than that of any other country. But for some, religion is more important than national interest, it seems. Chinese and Indians are Singaporeans first. Their race or religion is secondary. You young Malays are Muslim first and barely Singaporean. Beware of mongrel identity crisis. Mixed breed mongrel Josephine Chia wrote a long article on why mixed breed mongrel is VIP. I'm Chinese by race but am proud to have 5,000 years of rich history. I'm not going to label myself a primitive Southeast Asian who built houses out of grass and wooden stakes even in the 19th century. Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I'm doing my normal evening cardio as usual, and today I would like to talk to you about a very, very trending topic. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel yet, guys. I really need you to subscribe because it'll keep you notified about my content. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin. Now first of all, this video is spoken from a Malaysian point of view, so I understand that there might be accusations of bias in this video. But first of all, I want to say that this is not meant to draw hatred against ordinary people of Singapore, who are by all accounts decent, salt of the earth, and honorable people. No, I'm not trying to draw hatred against Singaporean people in this video. But having said that though, we all know that the relationship between Malaysia and Singapore is kind of like the relationship between an ex-girlfriend and an ex-boyfriend. Well, that is to say, after the ex-boyfriend got dumped, the ex-boyfriend basically went on and became wealthy and successful. Not through completely scrupulous means, of course. But anyway, the point is, now there are many people, even in Malaysia, especially from the non-Malay community, who would like to gloat that Singapore is basically like the jilted ex who becomes a successful person, while Malaysia is like the ex-girlfriend who dumped that boy, right? But I don't think it's that simple. I think that there were various factors which led to the separation between Malaysia and Singapore, and the Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, is often
accused of being short-sighted because he didn't keep Singapore. He basically separated Malaysia and Singapore, and Lee Kuan Yew is treated like some kind of a visionary hero because apparently he picked up the pieces after that. But I argue that it was due to Tunku Abdul Rahman that Singapore was able to gain independence from Malaysia and flourish in the first place, because Singapore as a city-state as we know it would not exist if it hadn't been for Tunku, who partitioned that piece of southern territory to Lee Kuan Yew. So Western commentators often overlook the magnanimous nature of our Prime Minister, our first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, and they basically treat Lee Kuan Yew, their darling model minority Asian Lee Kuan Yew, as some righteous hero who was the victim of this situation. But in fact, it always takes two to tango, and it's not like Lee Kuan Yew was some angel either. Yes, an intelligent person, far-sighted person, but not a very nice person. But anyway, that's not meant to draw hatred against Singaporeans. The point is that the relationship between Singapore and Malaysia is like a relationship between two exes who have reconciled. But basically, there's always a bit of underlying tension between the two exes, right? And, you know, it is basically a love-hate relationship of competitiveness. We're always competing to see whose food is better. Spoiler alert, our food is better. But the relationship between Malaysia and Singapore, needless to say, is as spicy as sambal nasi lemak and asam pedas. Yes, it's a spicy relationship, that is to say. Now, I'm aware that my point of view is very different from many Chinese and Indian Malaysians who are of the opinion that Tunku Abdul Rahman should have kept Singapore. But considering that, you know, racial tensions were on the horizon, and basically Tunku saw the signs of racial riots all throughout the region. If he had kept Singapore, like a bad leg, he had to cut it off. This is just a very unpopular opinion among the Chinese and Indian Malaysians, and I'm going to get lambasted for this, but yeah, it is good that he cut it off, because we might not only have had one May 13, 1969, we might have had several May 13s if Tunku had kept Singapore, because racial tensions were brewing, racial riots were on the horizon if he had not ejected Singapore. But yeah, I mean, Tunku Abdul Rahman was a feudalist and he was a reactionary, but one thing you cannot charge him with is racism, because it seems to be very popular to charge Tunku Abdul Rahman with racism, explicit or implicit. When Western commentators talk about how Singapore was ejected, it seems to be a very popular charge to make against him, and whether it is explicitly or implicitly stated. But I stand by my point that had he not ejected Singapore, we might have had far, far more racial tensions, because Lee Kuan Yew was what we could describe as a batu api as well. What do we mean, like a political troublemaker? Because he was basically trying to rally the Chinese in the same way the UMNO reactionaries, United Malays National Organization reactionaries, were rallying the Malays. His speech was quite incendiary, and if Tunku had kept Lee Kuan Yew, well, that would have spelled trouble not only for his political career, but also for the whole of Malaysia. But by and large, Lee Kuan Yew himself was pretty damn reactionary when it came to race. Yeah, he was a race realist who believed East Asians were superior to Southeast Asians. That is a fact. I will show you some of his quotes. He's not some kind of saint that, you know, was ejected and is a totally innocent victim either. Because, yes, we are aware that UMNO, the reactionary grand old party in Malaysia, is a racist party. Lee Kuan Yew is basically like the Chinese version of UMNO, basically. I know liberals look to Singapore with a halcyon sort of lens, and they really see it as the ideal society that we should strive for. Malaysian liberals, I mean. Especially the English-educated boomer crowd. They say that it's a fair and meritocratic society and that they don't have race-based politics. But I argue that Singapore is really not that different from Malaysia, even though it always tries to make itself out to be. And that Singaporean right-wingers simply have better PR skills than Malaysian right-wingers. But when you look at Singapore and Malaysia and you compare them, you will find eventually that it's basically like looking at two mirror images juxtaposed with each other. Let me explain. See, recently on Twitter there was this Malay Singaporean lady who brought up her experience as a minority in Singapore. Now, as you know, Singapore is a very, very East Asian-centric society. Lee Kuan Yew's concoction of Asian values was very, very, very East Asian-centric, right? Even though he claimed to be the Asian values guy, he was really very East Asian-centric because he believed that Southeast Asians, in his opinion, this is not my opinion, he believed that Southeast Asians were mentally and genetically inferior to East Asians, as I've shown you in that quote. Now, the thing is, when Lee Kuan Yew said Asian values, he simply meant East Asian legalistic values, not even Confucian values. Now, the thing is, now, Lee Kuan Yew's quote himself, he himself said that you need to govern a Chinese society with a sharp hatchet. But it's very curious that he would describe Singapore as a Chinese society, because Singapore, as you know, is a multiracial, multicultural society. But there's always an underlying sinocentrism in Singapore that never gets brought up. It's kind of like how Crazy Rich Asians, even though it's supposed to represent the Southeast Asian experience, was very, very Chinese-centric. Well, with the exception of the leading man, that was a Brit who played a Peranakan. But the point is, Singapore, this is a very unpopular opinion, but Singapore is a very East Asian-centric kind of society. And it's also very, very much more Westernized than Malaysia. That's why Asian Americans who tend to be on the right-wing side of things find themselves very comfortable in Singapore. That's why Asian Americans tend to find themselves very comfortable in Singapore, because it fits their comfort zone, or it fits their mold of what true Asian society ought to be. But they wouldn't be very comfortable in Malaysia. But the thing is, the fact of the matter is that this lady was bringing up her experiences about minority erasure. So the treatment, basically the sidelining of minority cultures and treating them as not as inherent to the Singaporean identity, but rather as an inconvenient entity, so to speak. Lee Kuan Yew himself said it would be ideal if we were all Chinese, but not all of us are Chinese, so we just have to work with reality. That is Lee Kuan Yew's quote. And very often, just like Chinese and Indians in Malaysia are treated by right-wingers in Malaysia as an inconvenient minority, sort of like they're just there, but they don't really want Chinese and Indians there. You get the same mirror image in Singapore, when right-wingers in Singapore, especially the Sinocentric ones, tend to treat the Malay minority, not so much the Indians, but the Malays, as an inconvenient minority. Like they think that they're there, they should be grateful for being there. Oh, Jesus, that's a big black dog. See the dog? But the thing is that you see the kind of defensiveness that erupted after this lady brought up her experiences. You had a lot of these Chinese Singaporean reactionaries saying, you know, you people, you Malays only think about race and religion, and you are Malay first and Singaporean second. That's why we don't, you know, we can't, that is basically why we can't trust you guys. That's what they were saying. And of course, you will have Lee Kuan Yew supporters jumping up and saying, hey, this is not what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew stood for. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew wanted us all to hold hands and create a colorblind society where we'll all be seen as equal. Did he? I don't know if they actually have read what Lee Kuan Yew has said about other races, like blacks, for example. He's a fan of the bell curve, and he believed that blacks were dumber than Asians and whites. But Lee Kuan Yew was no race egalitarian, right? So time and again, Singapore, as I've said, it is not any less racist than Malaysia. It's just better at hiding its racism. And the thing is, the hypocrisy of Singaporean elite reactionaries gets proven when time and again the ghost of Lee Kuan Yew comes back to haunt Singapore. For example, you remember that professor who was harassing the Indian man with the Chinese girlfriend because he said, oh, you shouldn't steal Chinese girls, or basically we should stick to our own races. And then you had Lee Kuan Yew fanboys and fangirls saying, this is not what Lee Kuan Yew would have stood for. This is not the culture that he would have approved of. You bring disgrace to the name of Singapore. But I know I'm going to open up a very spicy can of worms, but I think Lee Kuan Yew would be nodding his head in agreement. Lee Kuan Yew didn't like interracial marriage either, okay? It's not... He himself said he would not be pleased if his child brought back a boyfriend or girlfriend of a different race. Yeah, look it up if you don't believe me. He might accept it, but the crux of the matter is that he would not be pleased, you see. And the fact of the matter is that people's mentality is shaped by their material conditions, and their material conditions are determined by the superstructure of a society. That is to say, the culture and institutions of that society. And who created the superstructure of Singapore other than Lee Kuan Yew? Yes, Singapore is basically created in the very spitting image of Lee Kuan Yew. So Singaporeans don't like the idea of that. They find themselves embarrassed by Jocelyn Chia because she made a joke about Malay people dying in a plane crash, right? Because the majority of Malaysia are Malay. So basically she was dehumanizing Malay people. Well, where did Jocelyn Chia get her education from? Singapore. You think Jocelyn Chia is the only Singaporean who thinks that way? The thing is that you cannot, at some point, you have to accept that the reason people are the way they are is because of the society that they are brought up in. And you cannot, if you're going to take credit for Singapore's success, you also have to take credit for Singapore's failures. Jocelyn Chia, for example, own her. Don't try to detach from her, because Lee Kuan Yew didn't like Muslims either. He wasn't terribly fond of Malays either. Own its failings as well, okay? Now, of course, what kind of future do I want for Malaysia? Definitely a change from what we currently have, but at the same time, I'm not too fond of the Singaporean model either, because, simply put, because it is basically a way to lead the masses into false consciousness that that's what's good for the masses. And basically the elites of each society, whether that be Malaysia or Singapore, will start to use each other as cautionary tales as to what would happen if the minorities took power. For example, the elite in Malaysia will say, if the Chinese and the Indians take power, look at what it becomes. They start marginalizing the Malays and the Muslims on their own ancestral land. And the elites in Singapore do the same thing. You think they're not above that sort of thing? They also point to Malaysia and say, look at what Malaysia is You see how backward and barbaric they are? This is what could happen if the Malays were given power. That's what the elites in Singapore say as well. So both sides are basically using each other as a cautionary tale. But just like my father once said, people who are very similar to each other often dislike each other a lot. And they really have a lot more in common than they care to admit. It's kind of like, you know, evangelical American Christians do not like conservative Muslims. And conservative Muslims do not like evangelical American Christians, even though they have so much in common. You see? But I hate to break it to you, Malaysia and Singapore are divided by a border, and they're both located in the same region. Geographically, they should both be in the global south. But one is a global north country, and one is a global south country. Malaysia is a global south country. How did this end up being the case? Well, that's because Singapore is far cozier with the neoliberal Western establishment, despite its Asian values claim, than Malaysia is. For example, Malaysia has unequivocally condemned Israel's brutal aggression against the Palestinians. What has Singapore been doing? Sitting on the fence. Lee Kuan Yew once said, Singapore must be a poisoned shrimp because we are surrounded by hostile neighbors that want to take over us. But that's not really the case. The neighbors of Singapore don't care about Singapore because Singapore is tiny. It's smaller than a state in Malaysia, okay? It's an insignificant little piece of spit on the map. No offense intended if you're Singaporean. But do you know why Lee Kuan Yew basically hyper-militarized Singapore and basically ensured that he could create some... He could ensure that every single able-bodied man was trained had military training? It's for the same reason as South Korea. It's not to protect against North Korea, because the North Koreans have not attacked South Korea, just like Malaysia has never attacked Singapore, you see. It's to serve the neoliberal Western establishment. If there should ever be further escalations in the Middle East, well, you know, the Americans and the Brits can always rely on their good friend in Southeast Asia to send them soldiers. Yes? And in exchange, because of that, it gets the privileges of being a global North country. Right? That is to say that it enjoys the good graces of the West because it is a good obedient puppet of the West. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not throwing stones from a glass house. Malaysian reactionaries themselves are beholden to the West, but Singaporean reactionaries more so. But despite the Singaporean elite's hypocrisy when it concerns race relations, in pretending to be more civilized than Malaysia, there is also the issue of what kind of a society you want. Now, yes, it's true that nobody starved under Lee Kuan Yew, but at the same time, Singapore is basically a hyper-capitalist reactionary paradise. It is a society where a small minority of elites controls the vast majority of wealth and resources. And basically, the wealth gap between the rich and the poor in Singapore is astounding, right? It's not something I think that we should be aspiring for, with due respect to our Singaporean friends. I think we need to just focus on socialism. No ifs, no buts, just socialism. Don't give me that bullshit about, trying to copy the American model or the British model or the Singaporean model. We just want socialism. At least we on the left in Malaysia. And we will get it. Because socialism is the only way that not only class antagonisms, but race antagonisms will be resolved. When there is no need to race bait and to play races against each other for the capitalist pleasure. Race-based politics would be superfluous under socialism, since, you know, there would be no need to play the working masses against each other. But I just want to end this video by saying that I strongly advise you guys not to fall into the trap of playing race politics. Now, even though your country may have reactionary politics, or it may discriminate against or marginalize certain groups, don't fall into the trap in thinking that this is an issue of race versus race, because the issue has always been class. But race is used in order to divide people of the working class, so that our capitalist exploiters, well, can exploit us more efficiently. It's far easier to exploit a population that is divided, because a divided population is unable to organize themselves efficiently. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, if you fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, this race is against that race, or that race is against this race, congratulations, you have successfully been divided. And, you know, even though Malay reactionaries, just like Singaporean reactionaries, they try to gaslight their own race by saying that, you know, if minorities take power, what will become of you? You know, you will be treated like third-class citizens on your own land. But the fact of the matter is that Malay elites despise working-class Malays. They hate working-class Malays. Look at how they talk about working-class Malays. Believe me, an elite bourgeois Malay would rather hang out with an elite bourgeois Chinese or Indian than they would with a working-class Malay. Don't believe me? Go to Bangsa. Go to the elite suburbs in Malaysia like Bangsa or Mangkiara. Look, there is no animosity in the bourgeois class, because they want us to have animosity against each other. Because you have so much more in common with a working class person of a different race and religion than you do with a capitalist of your own race and religion. I want to end this video by saying, don't be gaslighted into believing you need to have some kind of racial solidarity and race comes first over class, because it doesn't. That is not how the bourgeoisie thinks. That is not how the capitalists think. So, look, if you do that, then and you prioritize race over class, the bourgeoisie have won. And they are laughing themselves to the bank. But I'm going to end this video by saying that the only way that we can put an end for good to racial antagonisms is not by some neoliberal capitalist sort of economy, not even by importing the Singapore model, which obviously does have race antagonisms. They're just more hypocritical about it. No! The only way that we're going to put an end to racist antagonisms is through socialism. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. It's socialism or barbarism. Thank you.